some time ago. You know, the older I get, when I say some time ago, it could be 10 years ago, but it could be 50. And it was 50 years ago that I got introduced to something that I really had no idea about before going to seminary. And it was the possibility of there being other religions that might have some insight worth my consideration. Can you imagine that? And sure enough, one of them was the Zen Buddhist way. Now, the introduction came with a sermon that was called the Flower Sermon. And it happened during Buddha, Sakyamuni Buddha stood up. His disciples were gathered around him. All was silent. And he picked up a flower. Everything remained silent. And the people that were gathered round all sat there kind of bewildered. But there was one who smiled. And the Buddha knew that that person who smiled understood the meaning of the sermon. There remained no words. The sermon was done. Thank you for coming. No, I have a few other words to share, but it reminded me in my long Christian life of 20 or 22 years at that point, that Jesus did very similar things. In fact, I recalled one of them was, "Behold the lilies of the field." Remember? And I got to thinking that maybe Jesus really didn't say anything more than that. And that really what happened was that opened a discussion of insight after insight that opened up possibilities for those disciples. Behold the lilies of the field. And that was enough. Behold the birds another day. And that was enough. Behold the vine. Behold the door. Behold the child. Behold life itself. Behold love, hope, care, kindness. Behold injustice, suffering, and death. Somehow, all of those wind up being what I might even be working on this very moment, the new Bible reduced to its bare essentials. Behold. And I smile, and you do too. This past week, early in the week, I was reading a book, and I tell you, it's always a wonderful thing to read a book and notice that there is a little note that says, check out this below. And so you check out below, and there's another reference of some sort that helps you say, oh, look at this. Maybe it might be interesting to read that other book. So I did. I ordered Amazon.com, and they sent it to me in a couple of days. By the way, I paid for the postage. I just thought you might know that as an issue related to Amazon.com, but I did. And sure enough, the book came, and the title of the book, it was by a man named Edward Rothschild. 1934. So it's an old book, and sure enough, it has an old brown cover and torn a bit. The title of the book, The meaning of unintelligibility in modern art. Yay! That's worth a book having in hand, isn't it? Don't you think? Let me tell you, I started out almost immediately to find out what that was all about. And sure enough, there it was, a sentence that made all kinds of sense to me. Listen to this. It is inevitable that artists should be unintelligible because their sensitive nature, inspired by fascination, bewilderment, and excitement, expresses itself in the profound, intuitive terms of ineffable wonder. Oh. I'm glad you're here, Sanjay and Jeff. They're the artists whose work is downstairs in our gallery. A reference to this very strange thing of unintelligibility. And I have to tell you that if you find that little bit in the work of art that they have in their exhibition, I have to also tell you that I found that to be something that resonated with where I was 50 years ago in seminary, at a time that there seemed to me to be a love for this modern art, and this modern art and what we can call it unintelligibility had its own kind of magnetic draw for me. And as I found myself attracted to it, I also found myself attracted to another field that seemed highly unintelligible called theology. It too resonated with unintelligible concepts and ideas. And I remember at that time writing a paper. I was interested in surrealism at the time. Do you know what that is? Salvador Dali, Jean Miro, right? There are all kinds of surrealist artists, and I was attracted to them. I remember in college that I stood up, they actually had an art collection of books, and it was upstairs on the second floor, way back in the corner, and they had the art books. And I remember sitting down on the floor at Wheaton and opening these up and saying, whoa, look at this. Salvador Dali. Oh, look at this. Jean Miro. Oh, look at this. Look at this. Absolute wonder. And so as I looked, I decided in seminary I should write a paper called Toward a Surrealist Theology. How's that? Well, my professor was not exactly enthused about the unintelligibility of my paper. But I tell you, I was, because I was attracted to the unintelligible in both the theological realm and in the realm of art. Something to behold. Behold. Yeah, that's what Jesus said. Behold. Stay with it, because the unintelligible winds up having lots of things to say if we care to be there long enough to discover and unravel and be present for the voice that still might speak. This is National Poetry Month. Did you know that? April. Listen to the poets. Well, I have for some time been very interested in poetry because it too winds up dealing with the unintelligible too often, right? And in those poems, I very early on started memorizing some from time to time, and always paying attention to that deep wonder that poems called us to. And so as I was memorizing, well, you probably memorized some early poems too, didn't you? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, he makes me to lie. You remember that one? Or maybe you memorized another poem. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy king, did you? Or maybe you did another one. One that you learned in first grade, second grade, third grade. I don't know. I used to memorize these poems, though, thinking very carefully that maybe someday I might, this is true now, someday I might be in prison and not have a book, and I could entertain myself with what I memorized. It's true. I've never been in prison, although I visited. And I've been on long, singular walks in which the poems that I've memorized wind up saying something to me in the silence of my own footsteps. One of those poems was this: as once the winged energy of delight carried you over childhood's dark abysses, dark abysses. Have you ever had one? Have you ever experienced what might be called a dark abyss? Boy, I did. I was 8 years old. My grandfather died. And man, I went down into an abyss. I saw a great chasm open wide. I saw down there that there was absolutely nothing. And Grandpa, who I'd always admired for his stately nature, tall, white hair, very straight-looking Irishman. Wow. And now he was lying down. He wasn't saying a word. That casket lid was up. All those things that are associated with that. And I stood there and I could not believe that I was in the presence of something I had never been in the presence of before. A dead man. And it was true that somehow my little life at that time began to be aware of something that is very much a part of life, but I could not quite figure it out. Talk about the unintelligible. And it happened that I did somehow find a delight in the fact that my parents cared about me knowing what this was all about. And they walked with me through what that was. And they shared with me through my tears. And they shared with me so that I would know what the deep and uncertain experience of life was. Life was and includes death. The abyss was there, but somehow in that abyss there wound up being this little bridge that started to be built. The unimagined bridge that pulled me out of where I was, and actually, when I look back, that moment proved to be the most important time of my life up to that point, which was I could stand there and think and do in the face of and in the experience of death. Would that absolute everybody had the experience of being able to be with somebody who cared to enable them to do just that. Why? Because death is part of who we are, isn't it? You don't run away from it now, do you? You don't pretend. You're not one of those who pretends like it doesn't happen. You're not one of those who doesn't go to the doctor and acts like, oh, it'll go away, are you? Check out the abyss. It's ours to be. And it's that abyss over which we build bridges. The points of departure. T.S. Eliot said, the faith and love and hope are in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you are not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness is the dancing. Wonders happen if we can succeed in passing through the harshest dangers. So it is. So it was. And the harsh dangers add up over the years, don't they? Hey, by the time you're 70, by the time you're 80, you've probably had an operation. By the time life moves on and you see all kinds of things, maybe even an accident, maybe even something where your whole life seemed to be thrown overboard and you couldn't figure things out. Harsh dangers, they're part of the history of who we are. I had a friend who was an physical anthropologist. And it was a fascinating job. I'd never even thought much about it, but as she was talking with me, she said, you know, Sheldon, we go back and we look through the graves there in upstate New York, and we find the graves of some of the soldiers who had fought during the Revolutionary War. And we discover in them when I look at the bones, I discover what kinds of diseases they had. I discover what kinds of things that they had that probably brought about their death. I discover what kind of strength of person they were by observing what's left behind. It's fascinating. Our own bodies have a history of the things the harsh dangers we have experienced, and we move on. But we also, somewhere along the way, decide to work with things in the indescribable relationship. It's not too hard for us. The pattern grows more intricate and subtle, and being swept along is not enough. Part of my attraction to artists is the fact that they are very careful about what they work with. They know the indescribable relationship of brush and paint and paper, of line and color and shape. Check out Sanjay's work downstairs, and you will know. But then they also know wood, and they also know hammer, and they also know how to piece things together. They know cloth, and they know chant, and they know other things. Check out Jeff and Jeff's work downstairs and discover what it is to work in that indescribable relationship with things and make them into something to be considered. Being swept along is not enough for them, nor for us in the looking. Take your practice powers and stretch them out until they span the chasm of two contradictions. Well, you know, I've thought about that. I think it was last Sunday. All of a sudden, it dawned on me. You remember the story where those disciples all kind of came to the tomb at different times? And they looked in the tomb, and they considered what was there and what wasn't there. Remember that? It's an incredible story. Well, what touched me about that this time, like no other time, was that those people who were going to the tomb, they experienced one of Jesus' statements, possibly, where he says, the flower, the child, the birds, and now he says, the tomb. And so the disciples all went to the tomb, and what did they find? They found some very interesting things. In the deep, deep darkness, they found light. In the closed tomb, they found that it was open. In the death, they found life. And in the emptiness, they found fullness. Now, I don't know, but maybe you've walked over that bridge that looks down into the abyss, or maybe you've looked at the chasm of life, and maybe you've looked at the tomb and you find out that they're the same thing. And when you look long enough, eventually you wake up. And the power of death in our life is always, and we carry it with us. And we, in our brief moments, take steps, we make marks, we live our life, we do what we need to do to be the creative people that we all are, and we give ourselves to it. So I'm rewriting my brief, much briefer biblical book now. It has things in it like, behold the lily. It has, Jesus said, behold the lily. It doesn't have anything else. And then in the second page, it has, Jesus said, behold the door. And then Jesus said, behold the child. Behold the flower. Behold the tomb. And stretch your power, practice power, until it spans the chasm between two contradictions, and be who you are meant to be. For God loves you into being that person. Amen.